Enemy carrier planes attack. As the Nagumo force proceeded northward, our 4 carriers feverishly prepared to attack the enemy ships. The attack force was to include 36 dive bombers, 18 Veis each from Hiryu and Soryu, and 54 torpedo bombers, 18 Kates each from Akagi and Kaga, and 9 each from Hiryu and Soryu. It proved impossible, however, to provide an adequate fighter escort because enemy air attacks began again shortly, and most of our Zeros had to be used to defend the striking force itself. As a result, only 12 Zeros, 3 from each carrier, could be assigned to protect the bomber groups. The 102-plane attack force was to be ready for takeoff at 10:30. After Tone's search plane reported the presence of a carrier in the enemy task force, we expected an attack momentarily and were puzzled that it took so long in coming. As we found out after the war, the enemy had long been awaiting our approach, was continuously informed of our movements by the flying boats from Midway, and was choosing the most advantageous time to pounce. Admiral Spruance, commanding the American force, planned to strike his first blow, as our carriers were recovering and refueling their planes returned from Midway. His wait for the golden opportunity was rewarded at last. The quarry was at hand, and the patient hunter held every advantage. Between 0702 and 0902, the enemy launched 131 dive bombers and torpedo planes. At about 0920, our screening ships began reporting enemy carrier planes approaching. We were in for a concentrated attack, and the Nagumo force faced the gravest crisis of its experience. Was there any escape? An electric thrill ran throughout the fleet as our interceptors took off amid the cheers of all who had time and opportunity to see them. Reports of approaching enemy planes increased until it was quite evident that they were not from a single carrier. When the admiral and his staff realized this, their optimism abruptly vanished. The only way to stave off disaster was to launch planes at once. The order went out: speed preparations for immediate takeoff. This command was almost superfluous. Aviation officers, maintenance crews, and pilots were all working frantically to complete launching preparations. The first enemy carrier planes to attack were 15 torpedo bombers. When first spotted by our screening ships and combat air patrol, they were still not visible from the carriers, but they soon appeared as tiny dark specks in the blue sky, a little above the horizon, on Akagi's starboard bow. The distant wings flashed in the sun. Occasionally, one of the specks burst into a spark of flame and trailed black smoke as it fell into the water. Our fighters were on the job, and the enemy again seemed to be without fighter protection. Presently, a report came in from a Zero group leader. All 15 enemy torpedo bombers shot down. Nearly 50 Zeros had gone to intercept the unprotected enemy formation. Small wonder that it did not get through. Again, at 0930, a lookout atop the bridge yelled, "Enemy torpedo bombers, 30 degrees to starboard, coming in low." This was followed by another cry from a port lookout forward: "Enemy torpedo planes approaching 40 degrees to port." The raiders closed in from both sides, barely skimming over the water. Flying in single columns, they were within 5 miles and seemed to be aiming straight for AKGI. I watched in breathless suspense, thinking how impossible it would be to dodge all their torpedoes. But these raiders, too, without protective escorts, were already being engaged by our fighters. On Akagi's flight deck, all attention was fixed on the dramatic scene unfolding before us, and there was wild cheering and whistling as the raiders went down one after another. Of the 14 enemy torpedo bombers which came in from starboard, half were shot down, and only 5 remained of the original 12 planes to port. The survivors kept charging in as Akagi opened fire with anti-aircraft machine guns. Both enemy groups reached their release points, and we watched for the splash of torpedoes aimed at Akagi. But, to our surprise, no drops were made. At the last moment, the planes appeared to forsake Akagi, zoomed overhead, and made for Hiryu to port and astern of us. As the enemy planes passed Akagi, her gunners regained their composure and opened a sweeping fire in which Hiryu joined. Through all this deadly gunfire, the Zeros kept after the Americans, continually reducing their number. 7 enemy planes finally succeeded in launching their torpedoes at Hiryu, 5 from her starboard side and 2 from port. Our Zeros tenaciously pursued the retiring attackers as far as they could. Hiryu turned sharply to starboard to evade the torpedoes, and we watched anxiously to see if any would find their mark. A deep sigh of relief went up when no explosion occurred, and Hiryu soon turned her head to port and resumed her original course. A total of more than 40 enemy torpedo planes had been thrown against us in these attacks, but only 7 American planes had survived long enough to release their missiles, and not a single hit had been scored. Nearly all of the raiding enemy planes were brought down. Most of the credit for this success belonged to the brilliant interception of our fighters, whose swift and daring action was watched closely from the flagship. No less impressive was the dauntless courage shown by the American flyers, who carried out the attack despite heavy losses. Shipboard spectators of this thrilling drama watched spellbound, blissfully unaware that the worst was yet to come. As our fighters ran out of ammunition during the fierce battle, they returned to the carriers for replenishment, but few ran low on fuel. Service crews cheered the returning pilots, patted them on the shoulder, and shouted words of encouragement. As soon as a plane was ready again, the pilot nodded, pushed forward the throttle, and roared back into the sky. This scene was repeated time and again as the desperate air struggle continued. 5 fateful minutes. Preparations for a counterstrike against the enemy had continued on board our 4 carriers throughout the enemy torpedo attacks. One after another, planes were hoisted from the hangar and quickly arranged on the flight deck. There was no time to lose. At 10:20, Admiral Nagumo gave the order to launch when ready. On Akagi's flight deck, all planes were in position with engines warming up. The big ship began turning into the wind. Within 5 minutes, all her planes would be launched. 5 minutes. Who would have dreamed that the tide of battle would shift completely in that brief interval of time? Visibility was good. Clouds were gathering at about 3,000 meters, however, and though there were occasional breaks, they afforded good concealment for approaching enemy planes. At 10:24, the order to start launching came from the bridge by voice tube. The air officer flapped a white flag, and the first Zero fighter gathered speed and whizzed off the deck. At that instant, a lookout screamed, "Hell divers!" I looked up to see 3 black enemy planes plummeting toward our ship. Some of our machine guns managed to fire a few frantic bursts at them, but it was too late. The plump silhouettes of the American Dauntless dive bombers quickly grew larger, and then a number of black objects suddenly floated eerily from their wings. Bombs. Down they came straight toward me. I fell intuitively to the deck and crawled behind a command post mantele. The terrifying scream of the dive bombers reached me first, followed by the crashing explosion of a direct hit. There was a blinding flash, and then a second explosion, much louder than the first. I was shaken by a weird blast of warm air. There was still another shock, but less severe, apparently a near miss. Then followed a startling quiet as the barking of guns suddenly ceased. I got up and looked at the sky. The enemy planes were already gone from sight. The attackers had gotten in unimpeded because our fighters, which had engaged the preceding wave of torpedo planes only a few moments earlier, had not yet had time to regain altitude. Consequently, it may be said that the American dive bombers' success was made possible by the earlier martyrdom of their torpedo planes. Also, our carriers had no time to evade because clouds hid the enemy's approach until he dove down to the attack. We had been caught flat-footed in the most vulnerable condition possible, decks loaded with planes, armed and fueled for an attack. Looking about, I was horrified at the destruction that had been wrought in a matter of seconds. There was a huge hole in the flight deck, just behind the amidship elevator. The elevator itself, twisted like molten glass, was drooping into the hangar. Deck plates reeled upward in grotesque configurations. Planes stood tail up, belching livid flame and jet-black smoke. Reluctant tears streamed down my cheeks as I watched the fire spread, and I was terrified at the prospect of induced explosions, which would surely doom the ship. I heard Masuda yelling, "Inside! Get inside! Everybody who isn't working, get inside!" Unable to help, I staggered down a ladder and into the ready room. It was already jammed with badly burned victims from the hangar deck. A new explosion was followed quickly by several more, each causing the bridge structure to tremble. Smoke from the burning hangar gushed through passageways and into the bridge and ready room, forcing us to seek other refuge. Climbing back to the bridge, I could see that Kaga and Soryu had also been hit and were giving off heavy columns of black smoke. The scene was horrible to behold. Akagi had taken 2 direct hits, one on the after rim of the amidship elevator, the other on the rear guard on the port side of the flight deck. Normally, neither would have been fatal to the giant carrier, but induced explosions of fuel and munitions devastated whole sections of the ship, shaking the bridge and filling the air with deadly splinters. As fire spread among the planes lined up wing to wing on the after flight deck, their torpedoes began to explode, making it impossible to bring the fires under control. The entire hangar area was a blazing inferno, and the flames moved swiftly toward the bridge. Because of the spreading fire, our general loss of combat efficiency, and especially the severance of external communication facilities, Nagumo's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Kusaka, urged that the flag be transferred at once to light cruiser Nagara. Admiral Nagumo gave only a half-hearted nod, but Kusaka patiently continued his entreaty. "Sir, most of our ships are still intact. You must command them." The situation demanded immediate action, but Admiral Nagumo was reluctant to leave his beloved flagship. Most of all, he was loath to leave behind the officers and men of Akagi, with whom he had shared every joy and sorrow of war. With tears in his eyes, Captain Aoki spoke up. "Admiral, I will take care of the ship. Please, we all implore you, shift your flag to Nagara and resume command of the force." Air action, 4th of June, 1942. At this moment, Lieutenant Commander Nishibayashi, the flag secretary, came up and reported to Kusaka. "All passages below are afire, sir. The only means of escape is by rope from the forward window of the bridge down to the deck, then by the outboard passage to the anchor deck. Nagara's boat will come alongside the anchor deck port, and you can reach it by rope ladder." Kusaka made a final plea to Admiral Nagumo to leave the doomed ship. At last convinced that there was no possibility of maintaining command from Akagi, Nagumo bade the captain goodbye and climbed from the bridge window with the aid of Nishibayashi. The chief of staff and other staff and headquarters officers followed. The time was 10:46. On the bridge there remained only Captain Aoki, his navigator, the air officer, a few enlisted men, and myself. Aoki was trying desperately to get in touch with the engine room. The chief navigator was struggling to see if anything could be done to regain rudder control. The others were gathered on the anchor deck fighting the raging fire as best they could. But the unchecked flames were already licking at the bridge. Hammock mantelets around the bridge structure were beginning to burn. The air officer looked back at me and said, "Fuchida, we won't be able to stay on the bridge much longer. You'd better get to the anchor deck before it is too late." In my condition, this was no easy task. Helped by some sailors, I managed to get out of the bridge window and slid down the already smoldering rope to the gun deck. There, I was still 10 feet above the flight deck. The connecting monkey ladder was red hot, as was the iron plate on which I stood. There was nothing to do but jump, which I did. At the same moment, another explosion occurred in the hangar, and the resultant blast sent me sprawling. Luckily, the deck on which I landed was not yet afire, for the force of the fall knocked me out momentarily. Returning to consciousness, I struggled to rise to my feet, but both of my ankles were broken. Crewmen finally came to my assistance and took me to the anchor deck, which was already jammed. There I was strapped into a bamboo stretcher and lowered to a boat which carried me, along with other wounded, to light cruiser Nagara. The transfer of Nagumo's staff and of the wounded was completed at 11:30. The cruiser got under way, flying Admiral Nagumo's flag at her mast. Meanwhile, efforts to bring Akagi's fires under control continued, but it became increasingly obvious that this was impossible. As the ship came to a halt, her bow was still pointed into the wind, and pilots and crew had retreated to the anchor deck to escape the flames, which were reaching down to the lower hangar deck. When the dynamos went out, the ship was deprived not only of illumination, but of pumps for combating the conflagration as well. The fireproof hangar doors had been destroyed, and in this dire emergency, even the chemical fire extinguishers failed to work. The valiant crew located several hand pumps, brought them to the anchor deck, and managed to force water through long hoses into the lower hangar and decks below. Firefighting parties, wearing gas masks, carried cumbersome pieces of equipment and fought the flames courageously. But every induced explosion overhead penetrated to the deck below, injuring men and interrupting their desperate efforts. Stepping over fallen comrades, another damage control party would dash in to continue the struggle, only to be mowed down by the next explosion. Corpsmen and volunteers carried out dead and wounded from the lower first aid station, which was jammed with injured men. Doctors and surgeons worked like machines. The engine rooms were still undamaged, but fires in the middle deck sections had cut off all communication between the bridge and the lower levels of the ship. Despite this, the explosions, shocks, and crashes above, plus the telegraph indicator which had rung up "Stop," told the engine room crews in the bowels of the ship that something must be wrong. Still, as long as the engines were undamaged and full propulsive power was available, they had no choice but to stay at general quarters. Repeated efforts were made to communicate with the bridge, but every channel of contact, including the numerous auxiliary ones, had been knocked out. The intensity of the spreading fires increased until the heat-laden air invaded the ship's lowest sections through the intakes, and men working there began falling from suffocation. In a desperate effort to save his men, the chief engineer, Commander K. Tampo, made his way up through the flaming decks until he was able to get a message to the captain reporting conditions below. An order was promptly given for all men in the engine spaces to come up on deck, but it was too late. The orderly who tried to carry the order down through the blazing hell never returned, and not a man escaped from the engine rooms. As the number of dead and wounded increased and the fires got further out of control, Captain Aoki finally decided at 1800 that the ship must be abandoned. The injured were lowered into boats and cutters sent alongside by the screening destroyers. Many uninjured men leapt into the sea and swam away from the stricken ship. Destroyers Arashi and Nowaki picked up all survivors. When the rescue work was completed, Captain Aoki radioed to Admiral Nagumo at 1920 from one of the destroyers, asking permission to sink the crippled carrier. This inquiry was monitored by the Combined Fleet flagship, whence Admiral Yamamoto dispatched an order at 22:25 to delay the carrier's disposition. Upon receipt of this instruction, the captain returned to his carrier alone. He reached the anchor deck, which was still free from fire, and there lashid himself to an anchor to await the end. Standby destroyer, Arashi received word at midnight that an enemy force was 90 miles to the east of Akagi's and her own position. 1 hour later, a lookout sighted several warships through the darkness, and the commander of the destroyer division, Captain K. Ariga, gave chase with all 4 of his ships, Arashi, Nowaki, Hagikaze, and Maikaze. He failed to catch up with or identify these shadows, however, and returned to stand by the carrier. It later turned out that the mysterious ships belonged to Rear Admiral Tanaka's Destroyer Squadron 2. When Admiral Yamamoto ordered the delay in disposing of Akagi, it was because he saw no need for haste in this action, since his force was then proceeding eastward to make a night attack on the enemy. Now, however, as defeat became apparent and the prospect of a night engagement grew dim, a quick decision became necessary. At 03:50 on 5th June, Admiral Yamamoto finally gave the fateful order to scuttle the great carrier. Admiral Nagumo relayed the order to Captain Ariga, directing him to rejoin the force when his mission had been accomplished. Ariga, in turn, ordered his 4 destroyers to fire torpedoes at the doomed ship. Nowaki's skipper, Commander Magotaro Koga, later described how painful it was for him to fire the powerful new Type 93 torpedo into the carrier, which was his first target of the war. Within 20 minutes, all 4 destroyers had fired. 7 minutes later, the sea closed over the mighty ship, and a terrific underwater explosion occurred, sending out shocks that were felt in each destroyer. The carrier's final resting place was at latitude 30°30 N, longitude 179°08 W. The time was 0455, just minutes before sunrise. All but 263 members of the carrier's crew survived this last of her great battles. Before the fatal torpedoes were fired, Akagi's navigator, Commander Y. Miura, had boarded the carrier and persuaded Captain Aoki to give up his determination to go down with the ship. Both men finally moved safely to one of the destroyers. Kaga, which had been hit almost simultaneously with Akagi in the sudden dive-bombing attack, did not last as long as the flagship. 9 enemy planes had swooped down on her at 10:24, each dropping a single bomb. The first 3 were near misses, which sent up geysers of water around her without doing any damage, but no fewer than 4 of the next 6 bombs scored direct hits on the forward, middle, and after sections of the flight deck. The bomb which struck closest to the bow landed just forward of the bridge, blowing up a small gasoline truck, which was standing there and spreading fire and death throughout the bridge and surrounding deck area. Captain Jisaku Okada and most of the other occupants of the ship's nerve center were killed on the spot. The senior officer to survive the Holocaust was Commander Takahisa Amagai, the air officer, who immediately took command of the carrier. Furious fires broke out, seemingly everywhere. During the succeeding hours, damage control crews fought desperately to check the spreading flames, but their efforts were largely unavailing, and there was scarcely a place of shelter left in the entire ship. Commander Amagai was forced to seek refuge on the starboard boat deck, where he was joined by many of the men. The carrier's doom seemed imminent. Some 3.5 hours after the bombing attack, a new menace appeared. The flame-racked carrier now lay dead in the water and had begun to list. Commander Amagai, scanning the adjacent sea, suddenly discerned the telltale periscope of a submarine a few thousand meters from the ship. Minutes later, at 14:10, Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Kunisada, a damage control officer, saw 3 white torpedo wakes streaking toward the carrier. They seemed sure to hit, and Kunisada closed his eyes and prayed as he waited for the explosions. None came. 2 of the torpedoes barely missed the ship, and the third, though it struck, miraculously failed to explode. Instead, it glanced off the side and broke into 2 sections, the warhead sinking into the depths while the buoyant after section remained floating nearby. Several of Kaga's crew, who were swimming about in the water after having jumped or been blown overboard when the bombs struck the carrier, grabbed onto the floating section and used it as a support while awaiting rescue. Thus did a weapon of death become instead a lifesaver in one of the curious twists of war. Kaga's protecting destroyers, Hagikaze and Maikaze, were unaware of the submarine's presence until the torpedo attack occurred. Immediately, they sped out to its suspected location and delivered a heavy depth-charge attack, the results of which were not known. The submarine failed to reappear, so the destroyers turned back to the crippled carrier and resumed rescue operations. Meanwhile, uncontrollable fires continued to rage throughout Kaga's length, and finally, at 1640, Commander Amagai gave the order to abandon ship. Survivors were transferred to the two destroyers standing by. 2 hours later, the conflagration subsided enough to enable Commander Amagai to lead a damage control party back on board in the hope of saving the ship. Their valiant efforts proved futile, however, and they again withdrew. The once crack carrier, now a burning hulk, was wrenched by two terrific explosions before sinking into the depths at 1925 in position 30°20 N 179°17 W. In this battle, 800 men of Kaga's crew, 1/3 of her complement, were lost. Soryu, the third victim of the enemy dive-bombing attack, received one hit fewer than Kaga, but the devastation was just as great. When the attack broke, deck parties were busily preparing the carrier's planes for takeoff, and their first awareness of the onslaught came when great flashes of fire were seen sprouting from Kaga, some distance off to port, followed by explosions and tremendous columns of black smoke. Eyes instinctively looked skyward, just in time to see a spear of 13 American planes plummeting down on Soryu. It was 10:25. 3 hits were scored in as many minutes. The first blasted the flight deck in front of the forward elevator, and the next 2 straddled the amidship elevator, completely wrecking the deck and spreading fire to gasoline tanks and munition storage rooms. By 10:30, the ship was transformed into a hell of smoke and flames, and induced explosions followed shortly. In the next 10 minutes, the main engine stopped, the steering system went out, and fire mains were destroyed. Crewmen, forced by the flames to leave their posts, had just arrived on deck when a mighty explosion blasted many of them into the water. Within 20 minutes of the first bomb hit, the ship was such a mass of fire that Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto ordered, "Abandon ship." Many men jumped into the water to escape the searing flames and were picked up by destroyers, Hamikaze and Isokaze. Others made more orderly transfers to the destroyers. It was soon discovered, however, that Captain Yanagimoto had remained on the bridge of the blazing carrier. No ship commander in the Japanese Navy was more beloved by his men. His popularity was such that whenever he was going to address the assembled crew, they would gather an hour or more in advance to ensure getting a place up front. Now, they were determined to rescue him at all costs. Chief Petty Officer Abe, a Navy wrestling champion, was chosen to return and rescue the captain because it had been decided to bring him to safety by force if he refused to come willingly. When Abe climbed to Soryu's bridge, he found Captain Yanagimoto standing there motionless, sword in hand, gazing resolutely toward the ship's bow. Stepping forward, Abe said, "Captain, I have come on behalf of all your men to take you to safety. They are waiting for you. Please come with me to the destroyer, sir." Nagumo Force Action, 4th of June, 1942. Track of flagship Akagi up to 11:25. Nagara thereafter. When this entreaty met with silence, Abe guessed the captain's thoughts and started toward him with the intention of carrying him bodily to the waiting boat. But the sheer strength of will and determination of his grim-faced commander stopped him short. He turned tearfully away, and as he left the bridge, he heard Captain Yanagimoto calmly singing Kimigayo, the national anthem. At 1913, while her survivors watched from the nearby destroyers, Soryu finally disappeared into a watery grave, carrying with her the bodies of 718 men, including her captain. The position of the sinking was 30°38 N, 179°13 W. Not one of the many observers who witnessed the last hours of this great carrier saw any sign of an enemy submarine or of submarine torpedoes. There was a succession of explosions in the carrier before she sank, but these were so unquestionably induced explosions that they could not have been mistaken for anything else. It seems beyond doubt, therefore, that American accounts which credit U.S. submarine Nautilus with delivering the coup de grace to Soryu have confused her with Kaga. Nor, as already related, did the submarine attack on Kaga contribute in any way to her sinking. Hiryu's gallant fight. When enemy bombs rendered Akagi incapable of functioning as fleet flagship, temporary command of the Nagumo force was automatically assumed by Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe, Commander Cruiser Division 8, in his own flagship, Heavy Cruiser Tone. At the same time, command of air operations passed to Rear Admiral Tamun Yamaguchi, Commander Carrier Division 2, whose flagship, Hiryu, was the only carrier left undamaged after the devastating enemy attack. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi was one of the ablest commanding officers in the Japanese Navy. At the Naval Academy, he had graduated second in his class. But unlike many honor graduates whose ability in the classroom failed to translate itself into ability in battle, he was daring and far-sighted, a clear-thinking and resolute commander with a capacity for quick decision. Although defeat now stared us starkly in the face, the battle had to be continued as long as we retained even a small part of our striking power. Rear Admiral Abe quickly ordered Rear Admiral Susumu Kimura, Commander Destroyer Squadron 10, to stand by the 3 stricken carriers with light cruiser Nagara and 6 destroyers. Nagara was to become the force flagship after taking on board Admiral Nagumo and his staff from the disabled Akagi. 2 destroyers were assigned to screen each of the carriers and stand by to rescue the crews in case any ships had to be abandoned. The rest of the Nagumo force, centered around Hiryu, continued steadily north. With no time to lose, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi immediately decided to launch an attack on the American carriers. The attack force, consisting of 18 dive bombers and 6 escorting Zero fighters, took off at 10:40. It was commanded by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, a Hiryu squadron leader, who had been with the Nagumo force in every campaign. The planes flew toward the enemy at an altitude of 4,000 meters. On the way, groups of American carrier planes were sighted winging their way homeward, and Kobayashi signaled his pilots to follow stealthily behind. 2 of his covering fighters, however, indiscreetly pounced on the enemy torpedo bombers, reducing Kobayashi's escort to only 4 Zeros. When still some distance from their target, his planes were intercepted by enemy fighters who took a heavy toll. Nevertheless, 8 planes got through to make the attack. 2 of these were splashed by American cruiser and destroyer gunfire, but 6 bore in on the enemy carrier, scoring hits which started fires and raised billowing clouds of smoke. 3 Zeros and 13 dive bombers, including Kobayashi's, were lost in the attack. The 5 bomber pilots who returned brought back only fragmentary accounts, which did not present a very coherent picture. A summary of their reports seemed to indicate that 6 bombs had been dropped, but the number of hits was not known or agreed upon. They claimed that about 7 enemy planes had been shot down. One point of unanimity, however, was that an enemy carrier had been stopped and was sending up great columns of smoke. Admiral Yamaguchi concluded that it must have been hit by at least 2 250-kilogram bombs and severely damaged. What he did not know was that damage control parties in the U.S. carrier Yorktown, for she had been the target, had worked so effectively that by 1400 the carrier was again able to make 18 knots under her own power. At the first discover of the American carrier force, Admiral Nagumo had ordered Soryu to launch her new high-speed reconnaissance plane to make contact with the enemy and confirm his strength. The plane had been launched promptly, but it had not sent in any radio reports. On his return, the pilot found Soryu damaged and ablaze, so he landed on Hiryu's deck. Called before Admiral Yamaguchi, the pilot explained, "Radio trouble prevented my sending a message, so I hurried back to report that the enemy force contains 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown." This was startling news, even though the number of planes in the first enemy strike had already made it plain that the American force had more than the single carrier previously reported. Hiryu, now alone, faced 3 crack enemy carriers, only one of which had thus far suffered any damage. And one of these carriers was Yorktown, which we thought had been sunk, or at least very heavily damaged, in the Coral Sea battle. Admiral Yamaguchi decided to launch another attack with all his remaining planes. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, a Hiryu wing leader, was chosen to lead the 10 torpedo planes, 1 from Akagi, and 6 fighters, 2 from Kaga, which were then available in Hiryu. The left-wing fuel tank of Tomonaga's plane, damaged during the strike on Midway, had not yet been repaired. When his maintenance man mentioned this, Tomonaga merely smiled and said, "All right, don't worry. Leave the left tank as it is and fill up the other." The man spoke again after a moment's hesitation. "Yes, sir. But should we bring your plane to the starting line just the same?" Fastening his flight suit, Tomonaga answered calmly, "Yes, and hurry it up. We're taking off." So the damaged plane was moved into position. Several of Tomonaga's aviators begged him to exchange planes with them, but he cheerfully declined. Everyone knew that he would have insufficient fuel for the return flight, but no one mentioned it. It would have been no use, for clearly his mind was made up. Preparations were completed at 12:45, and the 16 planes rose from the flight deck to head for the enemy. Motionless as a statue, Admiral Yamaguchi watched the orderly takeoff, led by a man who knew that he would not return. Every spectator stood grim and silent, crushed by this cruel aspect of war, which allowed of no human feeling. One after another, the planes roared off the deck. Hands were raised in silent farewell, and tears welled in every eye. At 14:26, the attack group spotted an enemy carrier with several escorts some 10 miles ahead, and Tomonaga ordered his flyers to close for the attack. Protecting enemy fighters tried to intercept, but were promptly engaged by the escorting Zeros, while the torpedo planes bored in toward the carrier. At 14:32, Tomonaga ordered his planes to break from their approach formation and split up to make runs on the target from various directions. 2 minutes later, he ordered the attack. Swooping from an altitude of 2,000 meters to within 100 meters of the water, the planes headed straight for the American carrier. At 14:45, a radio message reported 2 torpedo hits on this ship, which was identified half an hour later as being of the Yorktown class. No further details of the attack were known until the surviving Japanese planes returned and were recovered by Hiryu at 16:30. Only 5 torpedo bombers and 3 fighters, half of the number launched, got back to the carrier. The pilots claimed 1 hit on a carrier and reported severe damage to a San Francisco-class cruiser, but later, information indicated that the claimed hit on the cruiser had actually been a Japanese plane splashing into the water nearby. 8 enemy fighters were also reported to have been shot down. Post-war American accounts show that around 1442 Yorktown actually received 2 torpedo hits, successfully evading 2 others which were aimed at her. The 2 hits, added to the damage inflicted by the earlier dive bomber attacks, were enough to doom the ship. But none of her escorts sustained any damage from this air attack. As had been fully expected, Lieutenant Tomonaga's plane was not among those which came back. Lieutenant J.G. Toshiro Hashimoto, who had flown with Tomonaga as observer in the first wave attack on Midway, but who was in a different plane in this attack, gave an eyewitness account of the finish of the gallant flight leader. His plane, with its distinguishing yellow tail, was clearly discernible as he broke through the heaviest anti-aircraft fire I have ever witnessed. He launched his torpedo, and then, in the next instant, his plane disintegrated. His assault on the carrier, in the face of that devastating gunfire, was tantamount to a suicide crash. So ended the second raid by Hiryu planes and the last Japanese strike on American ships in the Battle of Midway. The aviators who made the attacks, as well as Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, who heard their reports, believed that the first and second attacks had hit different targets, and hence that 2 American carriers had been mortally damaged. The fact was, however, that Yorktown was the target both times. So speedily had repairs been effected after the first attack that Tomonaga's planes had mistaken her for another and undamaged ship. Enemy carrier planes strike again. Having launched 3 air attacks, including the Midway strike, Hiryu was now almost devoid of planes. When the last returning plane of Tomonaga's group let down on the carrier's deck at 16:30, Hiryu had left, out of all her planes, only 6 fighters, 5 dive bombers, and 4 torpedo bombers. The flyers, who had pursued the deadly struggle since dawn, were at the limit of exhaustion, and the ship's crew was in scarcely better condition. While her own planes were attacking the enemy, Hiryu had been the target of repeated and relentless enemy strikes. Since sunup, no fewer than 79 planes had attacked, and the ship had successfully evaded some 26 torpedoes and 70 bombs. Nevertheless, despite his meager remaining air strength and the exhaustion of his men, Admiral Yamaguchi was still determined to fight back. He realized, however, that further daylight attack could not possibly succeed, and he decided to make a final attempt at twilight when his few planes would have a better chance of getting in to strike an effective blow at the enemy. There was a lull in battle shortly before 1700, and the opportunity was taken to serve a meal to the crew, who were still at general quarters. The fare was sweet rice balls, and everyone ate voraciously. But even during this brief respite, combat air patrol had to be maintained, making the most of the 6 remaining fighters. Preparations also went ahead for the planned dusk attack. In order to locate what was believed to be the enemy's only remaining carrier, Admiral Yamaguchi decided to send out a fast reconnaissance plane on search. At 17:03, just as this plane was ready to take off, a lookout shouted, "Enemy dive bombers directly overhead!" They had come in from the southwest, so that the sun was behind them, and having no radar, we were unable to detect their approach. 13 planes singled out Hiryu as their target. As the ship's anti-aircraft batteries opened up, Captain Kaku, Hiryu's skipper, ordered full right rudder, and the ship swung lumberingly to starboard. This timely action enabled Hiryu to evade the first 3 bombs, but more enemy planes came diving in and finally registered 4 direct hits which set off fires and explosions. Columns of black smoke rose skyward as the carrier began to lose speed. All 4 bomb hits were near the bridge, and the concussions shattered every window. The deck surface of the forward elevator was blasted upward so that it obstructed all forward view from the control area. Fire spread among the loaded planes on deck and cut off all passageway to the engine rooms. The doomed men below deck worked until they were overcome by the intense heat and suffocating smoke. Theirs was heroic courage and devotion to duty. As the last of our carriers was hit and damaged, the enemy planes began devoting their attention to the screening ships as well. Battleship Haruna had already been attacked at 16:49 by 4 level bombers, and 19 minutes later she was attacked again by 2 dive bombers. All bombs fell short, and the battleship went unscathed. Haruna escaped again at 18:26 when attacked by land-based bombers. Heavy cruiser Tone was the target of 3 dive bombers at 17:20, 9 more at 17:28, and then 3 land-based bombers at 18:18, but no hits were scored. Chikuma eluded 9 dive bombers at 17:32, a single attack at 1745, and 3 land-based bombers at 1810. Hiryu finally slowed down to a halt at 21:23 and began a list which increased to 15 degrees as she continued to ship water. Fire pumps were disabled, as was the steering system, but repairs were later effected on one of the pumps, and it was worked vigorously to combat the flames. In the midst of these efforts, enemy B-17s attacked but failed to make any bomb bits. Kazagumo, flagship of Captain T. Abe, Commander-Destroyer, Division 10, was bravely and skillfully brought alongside the burning carrier to assist in fighting the fires and to supply the hard-working crew with food and drink. Destroyer Yugumo stood guard nearby. 2 desperate attempts to gain access to the engine rooms were unsuccessful. Finally, it became clear that there was no hope of saving the ship, and Admiral Yamaguchi sent a message to Admiral Nagumo via Destroyer Kazagumo, reporting that he was ordering Hiryu's crew to abandon ship. At 02:30, 5th June, he directed Captain Kaku to summon all hands topside. To the 800 or so men who responded, he gave these final instructions. As commanding officer of this carrier division, I am fully and solely responsible for the loss of Hiryu and Soryu. I shall remain on board to the end. I command all of you to leave the ship and continue your loyal service to His Majesty, the Emperor. Admiral Yamaguchi's staff begged permission to remain with him on the flagship, but their pleas were firmly rejected, and with sad reluctance they made ready to transfer to Kazagumo, standing alongside. Before parting, the admiral and his staff drank a silent farewell toast in water from a breaker near at hand. The senior staff officer, Commander Ito, asked if there were any messages the admiral wished to entrust to him. There were none, but Yamaguchi took off his black deck cap and gave it to Ito as a memento. He then asked for a length of cloth which Ito was carrying, so that he might lash himself to the bridge structure and thus be sure of going down with the ship. Captain Kaku himself was determined to stay, and accordingly besought the admiral to leave the ship. Yamaguchi smiled understandingly, but firmly rejected this proposal with a shake of his head. So the 2 commanding officers bade a last farewell to their subordinates, as a brilliant moon shone down on the devastation of the carrier's deck. Surviving members of Hiryu's crew had already begun to transfer to Kazagumo. Captain Abe, commander of the destroyer division, crossed over to the carrier in a vain effort to persuade Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku to leave the ship. As the last survivors were leaving the ship, these 2 officers climbed to the bridge, where they were last seen, waving goodbye to the men who had served them so long. The destroyers then pulled clear of the carrier, and Captain Abe gave the order to administer the coup de grâce in accordance with Admiral Yamaguchi's final instructions. As the torpedoes from Kazagumo and Yugumo found their mark at 05:10, there were deafening explosions, and the big carrier started to go down. The first streaks of dawn were just reaching into the eastern sky as Captain Abe witnessed the explosions, and, satisfied that his work had been accomplished, he ordered the destroyers to retire. His report that Hiryu had been scuttled in position 31-38N, 178-51W, was received in Yamato at 05:40. An hour and 20 minutes later, however, a plane from light carrier Hosho, which had been sent eastward to locate Nagumo's force, discovered Hiryu still afloat. The plane reported that men could be seen on board, and several pictures were taken of the smoldering derelict. Upon receiving this information, Admiral Yamamoto relayed it to Nagumo, ordering him to verify the scuttling and make every effort to rescue any survivors. Admiral Nagumo immediately detached Tanikaze for the mission and ordered a seaplane launched from flagship Nagara to cooperate in the search, but Hiryu was never seen again. In the light of American data obtained after the war, it is now known that Hiryu remained afloat until around 08:20. The men seen on deck were survivors of the engine room crew who had miraculously escaped from their entrapment below decks, when the torpedoes from Abe's destroyers blasted open a way of exit. When the carrier sank, they were set adrift and subsequently picked up by an American ship. Hiryu's last battle cost the lives of 416 crewmen, in addition to the 2 commanders who elected to perish with her. With the death of Admiral Yamaguchi, the Japanese Navy lost one of its most brilliant officers. He had generally been considered the most likely successor to Admiral Yamamoto for the post of Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet. His great courage and ability had inspired the confidence of his superiors, as it did the trust and faith of his subordinates. Grief at his loss was shared by every man who knew him. His classmate, Combined Fleet Chief of Staff Ugaki, recorded an appreciation of Yamaguchi in a diary entry of 6 June. He was indeed a far-sighted man. He was considerate of everyone, kind of heart, prompt of decision. His constructive recommendations, forcefully presented to his superiors, contributed greatly to the success of operations. In this matter particularly, he stood out from other commanding officers and earned a place of greatness. The commander of the 2nd Carrier Striking Force, Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, also paid a warm tribute to Yamaguchi when news of his death reached the Aleutians forces. He confided to Lieutenant Commander Okumiya of his staff, "How I wish that Yamaguchi had commanded this force. Gladly would I have served under him." And Yamaguchi had been a full year his junior. Retreat. Now, let us return to flagship Nagara, where the transfer of Admiral Nagumo's flag was completed at 11:30. 2 minutes earlier, a Chikuma search plane had radioed, "Enemy in position, bearing 070 Degao, 90 miles from our force. Time, 11:10. There was a brief interval of shocked surprise at this information. Then the senior staff officer, Captain Oishi, suggested to the admiral, "The enemy is much closer than we thought. If we advance at full speed, we might be able to engage him in a surface action." The enemy was now believed to have 7 cruisers and 5 destroyers accompanying his carriers. If our 2 fast battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers could engage them in a daytime surface action, we might be able to destroy the enemy ships with gunfire and torpedoes. In Nagara's immediate company, at this time, were only 5 destroyers. The others were standing by the 3 damaged carriers or steaming northward with battleships Haruna and Kirishima, heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma, and carrier Hiryu. Admiral Nagumo considered Oishi's proposal until 11:53 and then acted upon it. A terse radio order was flashed to all units of the force. "We will go to the attack now. Assemble!" The order was repeated at 11:56 and again at 11:59. The last of these messages directing the formation of a battle line on course 170 Degine in the order of Destroyer Squadron 10, Cruiser Division 8, and Battleship Division 3. Nagara, meanwhile, had set course to the northeast at a speed of 24 knots to make the rendezvous. Just before issuing these orders, Admiral Nagumo had dispatched a message to Admiral Yamamoto and Midway Invasion Force Commander Vice Admiral Kondo to notify them of his present situation and plans. The message, sent at 11:50, stated, "As a result of enemy bombing attack at about 10:30, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu sustained considerable damage, outbreak of fires rendering them inoperational. I have transferred to Nagara and plan to withdraw to the north with my entire force after attacking the enemy." At 1300, however, Tone's search plane reported the discouraging news that the enemy was withdrawing. Since he had air superiority, it was to be expected that he would maintain a safe distance from the Japanese force and make repeated air attacks. With his screening force limited to cruisers and destroyers, it would have been foolish for him to risk a duel of gunfire and torpedoes. Moreover, his ships were supported by Midway-based air forces, and he had plenty of planes for reconnaissance. It was clear that, however desperately we dashed ahead, there would be little chance of engaging in a successful battle. We would only be throwing ourselves into the enemy's trap. Consequently, after Nagara had been speeding northeastward for a little more than an hour, Nagumo and his staff decided to give up the idea of a daylight battle. But something had to be done, and the next best possibility was a night engagement. Accordingly, Admiral Nagumo decided to retire westward temporarily while preparing to engage the enemy in a night battle. By 1445, Nagara had caught up with Hiryu and the other ships, and the force reformed with the flagship taking the lead, the carrier in the center, and the battleships and cruisers on the flanks. At 1620, Nagumo received word from Rear Admiral Yamaguchi that Hiryu was preparing to launch her remaining planes for a dusk attack on the enemy carriers. The striking force commander assented to this plan, but he nevertheless ordered the force to head due west, away from the enemy, while the attack preparations were being made. Yamaguchi planned to launch his planes at 1800. At 1703, however, as already related, enemy dive bombers struck again, disabling Herr Ryu and depriving the Nagumo force of its last remaining air strength. Nagumo's staff realized that the battle was lost and that the only hope was to avoid further destruction. But each man felt a personal responsibility for the defeat, and none could bring himself to suggest withdrawal. The grim situation was painfully clear. Our air strength was wiped out. The enemy still had at least one carrier intact. We had failed to render the Midway airfields ineffective, and some of our ships were still within striking range of planes based there. With command of the air firmly in enemy hands, the outcome of the battle was a foregone conclusion. What slim hopes remained for carrying out a night engagement faded considerably when, at 1733, another plane reported that the enemy task force was still withdrawing eastward. Nagumo's irritation at this news was obvious. Nevertheless, Oishi continued his efforts to pave the way for a night battle. He requested Nagara, which carried the only night scouting plane in the force, to ready it for a search to locate the enemy. An engagement was, of course, impossible unless the enemy was located, and it was generally recognized that there was little chance that a single plane could find the enemy ships in the dark of night. This gave rise to a growing skepticism among the rest of Nagumo's staff officers, but Oishi pressed his plan persistently. He further recommended that all destroyers standing by the damaged carriers be summoned to augment the force for the night engagement. Admiral Nagumo gave his approval to this suggestion, and the order was issued for all forces, including the standby destroyers, to assemble. This action came as a complete surprise to the other staff officers. What would become of the crews if these ships should sink with no rescuers at hand? Furthermore, unless a withdrawal could be effected before dawn, after rescuing the crews and disposing of the damaged carriers, all would become daylight targets for rampaging enemy planes. These thoughts must have occurred to everyone, but they remained unspoken. At 1830, a blinker message from Chikuma served further to deepen the gloom in Nagara. It read, "At 1713, this ship's number 2 plane sighted 4 enemy carriers, 6 cruisers, and 15 destroyers at a point 30 miles east of the burning carrier. The enemy force is proceeding westward." This message forced a re-examination of our plans, since it showed the enemy to be far stronger than we had estimated. It would take more than good luck for our force, with no radar and only 1 night scouting plane, to find and successfully engage this enemy. And if we failed in a night engagement, there would be no chance of eluding dawn attacks. Our ships would be like sitting ducks. Realizing this, Admiral Nagumo finally decided to forego a night action attempt and chose the wiser course of retiring to live and fight another day. The rescue destroyers were ordered back to the disabled carriers. The battle lost, Nagumo withdrew to the northwest, burning Hiryu tagged along, but she was soon outdistanced and had to be left behind with destroyers Kazagumo and Yugumo standing by.